All right, in this video, we are going to begin discussing inflation. Specifically, we'll identify what inflation is, we'll give it a definition, and we'll talk about one of the price indices that is used to measure inflation, the GDP deflator. So, what is inflation? Well, the inflation rate is just how much prices are increasing. Okay, it is the year-over-year percentage increase in a price level. Now, we're going to look at two different price levels. We're going to look at the GDP deflator, and we're going to look at the consumer price index. This is assuming that prices are increasing, and they usually do. However, the situation when prices decrease is called deflation, just negative inflation. Specifically, inflation, when we measure this year-over-year percentage increase, well, what we're doing is we're taking the difference between this year's prices and last year's prices and seeing how much they've grown since last year. So when you find an inflation rate, all you're really finding is the growth rate, something we've seen before. All you're finding is the growth rate in the price level. And again, we have two different ways to finding the price level. One is the GDP deflator, which we'll go over next, and the next being consumer price index. So when we're finding this inflation rate, remember, we're finding the growth rate in the price level. So when we find the growth rate of anything, we're taking this year's level, specifically this year's price level, subtracting from it last year's price level, and then dividing through by last year's price level. So this numerator is kind of like your nominal change, like how much is the overall increase, and then when you divide it by last year's value, it puts it in a percentage form. Okay, so that's how you find inflation. Again, it's just going to be the growth rate in the price level. So before we can find the growth rate in the price level, we have to understand how to calculate the price level. So again, we have two different ways of doing that: the GDP deflator and the consumer price index. We'll talk about the GDP deflator first. And the GDP deflator is just the ratio between nominal and real GDP for a particular year. Okay, so you're just taking the ratio, you're just taking nominal GDP and you're dividing through by real GDP. You're finding the ratio and then multiplying it by 100. Finding a ratio between nominal GDP and real GDP. And so when we're finding nominal GDP, what we're finding is the market value of all the goods being produced using current prices. So that's the key here, is this current prices idea. So nominal GDP, we look at goods priced at current prices. Well, the way we find that is by summing this almost looking capital E figure, this capital sigma, this capital Greek letter sigma means summation. And so what we're essentially doing, and we looked at it last time, is we're aggregating the market value of every good being produced at its current price with all other goods being produced in the economy, again, at the current prices. When we find real GDP, we're doing the same thing, except we're finding the market value using a base year's price. Okay, so when we're finding nominal GDP or the GDP deflator, really we're just taking the ratio between this year's prices or the current period's prices and the base period's prices. And the way we're taking that ratio is by weighting it by the amount of stuff being produced. So think of this QT, this quantity of goods that are being produced, think of this as a, let's call it a pricing weight. With the idea being that the more of something you produce, the larger weight it will have in affecting the overall price level. So if we're producing a lot of cars, well, if cars have a large price increase, well, because so many are being produced, we may see a larger increase in the price level than something that's not as commonly produced. I don't know. Let's say quills. Quills are not very commonly produced. Well, they're not, if they see a sudden increase in the price level, well, they're not really going to influence the overall price level because they have such a low weight, because such small numbers of quills are being produced each day, especially compared to like cars or something. Okay, so in finding GDP, the GDP deflator, the price level using the GDP deflator, again, we're taking this ratio between nominal and real GDP. Well, what you're going to do, just going through a little bit example, is you're going to first calculate nominal GDP, second calculate real GDP, and then find the ratio between the two. So this is a little bit of an example from last week, but we can go over it to help understand how the GDP deflator is found. So when we are finding nominal GDP for 2013, well, remember, we're going to use current year prices and current year quantities. So we'll say this summation of PT and QT, well, that's just going to be equal to the price of peanut butter in 2013, which is $5, times the amount of peanut butter produced, which is 30, plus the price of jelly in 2013, $2, times how much jelly is produced. Add that up, we get $5 times 30, 150, $2 times 100 equals 200. Therefore, we get $350. For real GDP, to calculate real GDP for 2013, well, remember that we're going to find the summation, but now we're going to use the base period prices. Okay? And we're going to use, our basket of goods is going to be this year's production. Well, in this economy, the only thing we produce is peanut butter and jelly. So using, again, 2012's prices, well, in 2012, peanut butter was priced at $4. The quantity produced in 2013 is still 30. For jelly, the price was still $2, same as it was in 2012, or same in 2013. And the quantity produced is still the quantity produced in 2013, which is 100. So what is the real GDP in 2013 using 2012 prices? Well, 4 times 30 is 120. 2 times 100 is still 200. 200 plus 120 equals $320. So when we plug these in to find our GDP deflator for 2013, we get a ratio. We get the ratio between $350 and $320. These are these 350 and 320. These are the values of nominal and real GDP respectively. We find them as a ratio. We found our GDP deflator to be 1.09. Okay, so essentially what we're saying is that prices have risen on average, weighted by the amount that they're of the good that's produced, weighted by the quantity of the good that's produced, that prices have risen by about 9% from 2012 to 2013 using the GDP deflator. In our next video, I want to mention, we will talk about finding the price level using CPI.